Hi, we don't have much time, so I'm going to be very quick. I'll introduce the panel. We have Kristin Schreiber, who is director of the COSME program at DG GROW at the European Commission. Gerard De Graaf, who just spoke, director of the Digital Single Market, DG Connect. Ali Khayrallah, the director of engineering at Ericsson. I don't know if you represent America or the EU here, because Ericsson is a very Swedish company. And finally, we have here Mr. Stallman, who's in charge of public policy at Google. Let me just say, because I kind of bridge these two areas, you can tell from my accent, but just to understand the importance of a single market. We have a single market in Europe for goods, services, people, capital, all moving, except when it comes to digital. It is easier to transport a bottle of wine from southern Portugal in the Algarve and sell it north of the Arctic Circle in Swedish Lapland than it is for me to buy, or to gift, to use an awful word, an iTunes record across well, basically 30 miles between where my home is in southern Estonia and the home where my wife is in northern Latvia. I can't do that. That sort of sums up the problem with the absence of a single market in digital. Just a little more background and then we'll open it up. But the idea, I mean, currently the Estonia, my country, holds the presidency of the EU. And for years, we knew it was coming and said, well, what are we going to talk about? And I'll tell you how that was born. It happened when I invited to visit me in my office when I was president, a 22-year-old kid about whom I had read in the newspaper. He had just graduated the technical university, and he'd gotten $300,000 sort of seed money for a startup. And since one of the things you do is you invite, bright, promising people to come and visit, and so he sat down in my office, and he said, well, thank you, Mr. President, for inviting me here, but I have to disappoint you. I'm moving to the United States in 2 weeks. And I said, why are you doing that? He said, well, there's no market here. I mean, even the biggest market is 82 million, and I have this startup that requires a big market. And there's no way you get money here. And these are the two big problems, I would say, facing Europe, and the digital single market addresses one of them. The other is a cultural issue. He started out with $300,000. 6 months later, he had $4.5 million. Already, he was at MIT, right outside MIT, and he sold his company 3 years after that for $100 million. That would not work in Europe. And if you understand why, imagine you're Steve Jobs. You've just said you don't believe in washing. You have long, greasy hair, and you walk into Deutsche Bank and say, I have an idea of a personal computer I'm working on in my garage. You'll be lucky if you don't get frog walked out of the Deutsche Bank, or whatever bank in Europe. 80% of funding in Europe is banks, and 20% is private equity. In the US, it's exactly the opposite. So when we're dealing with this digital single market and where are we and what do we need to solve, we can at least solve the first part of the problem. I'm not sure about the funding problem. I would just end up, unless you get too smug, the kind of completely ridiculous absence of any kind of security in this country that allows things like Equifax to happen could never happen in Europe, or if it did, it would be a continental-wide disaster, and a lot of people would go to jail. So, I mean, security has a much higher role in Europe, and the ADAS directive, which mandates basically giving secure identities to everyone, is a fundamental issue for all computer security, digital security, and it is not being addressed in this country, whereas in Europe, we're by fits and starts moving along, I would say. Anyway, what I'd like to open up with, just so that I don't have to talk anymore, because you're tired of me, is that I'd ask each of the panelists, since we have two from Europe and two from the United States, how do you see the three biggest problems? We have a list of 5 agenda items, but what are the 3 biggest things that need to be solved? And since this is the United States, I'll give the Americans a chance to say, because in America, I found people have very bizarre ideas of what the European Union is about. So, go ahead, sir.
Okay. I work in mobile technology, and obviously, this is a kind of industry where we need a common language. So we resort to standards. And standard bodies allow fierce competitors to collaborate in some reasonable way to come up with this common language, and then they can go back and compete and beat up on each other. And it's very important for us to have a global scale. Like 4G was very successful because we had one standard globally. Ericsson almost went under in the 2000s because we had 3 standards or more. And similar things don't help in R&D. So I think, from our industrial perspective and global perspective, it's extremely important to have common standards. And I think sometimes there's the notion that standards are sort of the opposite of innovation and so on, but it's completely wrong because, you have big companies, small companies, you have a lot of work that comes out of academia that ends up in standards. So it is, if you want to do things on a global scale, and if you're in the mobile industry in particular, but in a lot of other industries, you need a common language. And that's I mean, if I want to leave you with one idea here, is that in our business, fragmentation is the F word. So, we hate fragmentation. So that's it.
Great. Well, just one issue, fragmentation. Well, I mean, in fact, I should point out that GSM was a European standard that was taken over by the United States and the rest of the world. So there is no, it's not simply that it all comes out of here, this sort of little area. Mr. Stallman.
Yeah, I'll hit on a few more. I think that the keynote actually nicely put forward the challenges. Fragmentation is certainly one. I think also connectivity is still one. Definitely doing action on roaming is extremely helpful to connectivity across member states, but still a lot of what is happening in the digital space really depends on broadband abundance and competition, and maintaining a very healthy broadband ecosystem is very essential for all of the services that depend on the availability of networks. And then finally also skills training. I think this is a huge issue. It's essential to Google's growth engine is making sure that both that we give developers the tools that they need to succeed on our platforms, and also educate users in how to best use those tools to get the most out of them, because that's how you get the most out of technology, and also how you build trust with both the developers and users.
Mrs. Schreiber.
Well, I think if we look at issues which we still have to address in the single market, is we have very good financing opportunities, etc., for creating a business for startups, but we're weak at the level of scale-ups. So basically, when you look at big venture capital needs there, I mean, in Europe, our average fund size is 13% of that in the US. So this is something where we have to do and something about it, because this is why, I mean, as you said very nicely in your keynote, I mean, we want companies to go to the US and scale up there if they want to, and if we want them to have additional markets, but we don't want them to feel forced to scale up in the US because they can't do it in Europe. So I think that's the biggest issue we face. On the single market, I mean, we have the digital issues, but of course we still have some issues, let's say, in the classical single market, which affect startup scale-ups a lot. Notably in the area of taxes. So I think there is something we still have to move forward. And I think the last thing is, which was alluded already, we have to have a change, I would say, both in culture, mindset, but also we are working on the legislative front on second chance, on basically bankruptcy procedures, on allowing people, if they fail once, to get back on their feet and start a new company. And that's there, I mean, different strands. There's a legislative angle which we're trying to start to tackle, and there's of course the mentality switch which is comes, I would say, only gradually.
Well, I mean, I think the digital single market challenges are quite clear, but I think what is interesting, we talk about Europe, but Europe is very diverse. I mean, there is not such a thing as Europe. I mean, the member state that you come from is very advanced. I mean, the other member states are very advanced, and we've got member states who are behind. And so the first thing, we should not always look for kind of success outside of Europe. We've got success inside of Europe. And if we can multiply it, just very, very kind of practically, if the Germans would do a lot better than they do, if the French would do a lot better than they do, if the Italians would do a lot better than they do, like in connectivity. I mean, the German connectivity is pretty poor. Also in France, there are whole areas where you have no connectivity, or very limited connectivity. So if those would pull up their socks and do a lot better, I mean, the whole of Europe would do a lot better. So I think that's maybe where we need to start. And then obviously venture capital is I mean, and particularly also, I mean, we have excellent research in Europe. I mean, in our framework program, and we spend about 80 billion euros, so even more in dollars, over a 7-year period on research, development, and innovation. Are we getting enough innovation out of that to go to market? And I mean, no, we're not. We're not. So how can we do better? I mean, one of the things we will do very soon is to make transparent who is in our programs. What kind of innovations are in our programs? What kind of innovators are in our programs? What are their needs? So that venture capitalists and corporates and business angels, incubators can come and say, well, maybe I should have a word with those people. Maybe I can help them a little bit, and by helping them, I can help myself. So those are things which we can do where we don't necessarily need European legislation, because that's often heavy. It takes a couple of years. You must make sure that you get it right, because it's going to be on the books for 10 years. But there are things we can do without legislation.
But those things are always hard to achieve because there's cultural change. And as I said, when it comes to the financing side, that's a real hard one to beat. But let me get to something which is going to be a flashpoint, I think, almost immediately, beginning next week and will last for a while, which is the whole, and it affects Google, Facebook, and all of these the various US companies, is the issue of taxation. Because right now the problem is that huge amounts of revenue are generated by US corporations, and then they're all kind of based in Ireland and don't pay much in the way of taxes, and certainly not where they generate their income, which is a general principle of taxation. How do you see this issue, if any of you feels qualified to answer that? Maybe not.
Well, I think this comes back to an issue we debated a lot, I mean, in other words this morning as well, which is about fair competition and equal level playing field. And of course, it's difficult to explain to a smaller SME that they have high tax rates, whereas the large corporates get away through tax optimization with very low tax payments. So I think this is an issue which certainly needs to be tackled, because otherwise it creates wrong incentives. I mean, on the tax front, we have a number of issues. This is one. Another issue is, of course, that you have to make sure that in Europe we have the common VAT system, that it works better when you are in different member states. But also, like, if you take angel investments, I mean, we see a lot that in the US you can actually write off losses, whereas in Europe you can't do that. So we're actually working on that to see whether we could not move towards that direction, because then, of course, you have many more incentives to actually get people into angel investments.
Agree. I'm just going to confess that tax is a subject I've assiduously avoided since law school, so I won't be addressing that here.
Okay, well, that will be an issue, I point out, and you will see a lot of articles about this in the next several weeks and months. Just to say that is one area where the U.S. and Europe are going to be at loggerheads when it comes to technology. Because of this new model, and it all has to do with companies from within about a...
I mean, do the companies have a choice but to optimize their taxes in reality? I mean, if whatever loopholes exist today, for whatever reason they came about, I'm not sure that the companies can say, no, I want to pay more.
I agree. I just think that those loopholes will be... I mean, the models that are being proposed right now, some of them are pretty draconian. And the question is what will come out of this. Certainly the during the Estonian presidency, we will probably reach some kind of compromise on the nature of taxation, which will address this problem, which is a huge political problem, at least for certain countries in Europe, the ones that generate a lot of income, whose citizens generate a lot of income, but there's no tax that accrues from that. Other issues, well, I mean, again, my own personal sort of problem is, again, to talk about how big the difference is between Europe and the United States. Nelly Cruz, who was the commissioner before the current commission for digital matters, told me about 3 years ago, right before she left, that she had visited an incubator in Portugal with 45 startups in Lisbon. And she said every single one of them said as soon as they get their startup money, they're moving to Silicon Valley. And this is not sustainable. I mean, if every bright IT person thinks only I want to move to the United States, then Europe will be depleted of its brains, at least in one area. And this is clearly a concern, and I hope a driving force for the Europeans for the European political leaders, who sometimes I think haven't quite grasped the depth of the problem. But
Well, of course, that's the nightmare scenario, that we would just be hatching ideas and the ideas would then be transferred to the US and all the economic benefits would accrue to, at least initially, to the US. I mean, that's a scenario which we absolutely want to avoid, and the digital single market is one way of at least making sure that they don't have to leave Europe because they don't have access to a wide enough market. I think what also needs to be done, I mean, I'm always struck by perceptions stick in the minds of people. I mean, the world changes much faster than perceptions do, and so I don't know what perception you have about Europe, but many people have the perception that kind of Europe is always 1-2 steps behind, it's too slow, it's too rigid. It may still be true in some areas, but there's a lot of change happening in Europe. There's also a new generation. I mean, the average, say, density of startups in Europe is no less than in the US. I mean, there's the young people. I mean, the surveys 5 years ago, 10 years ago, what do you want to do with your life? I want to work in the public sector 10 years ago. If you ask the same question today, I want to have my own company, I want to grow, I want to be a startup, I want to be a scale-up. And I think we also need to talk to, I'm always struck, I'm more careful with kind of how I invest my money now, particularly through investment funds, but I'm always struck by how little investment fund managers look kind of beyond their own noses, as we say in Dutch, that they don't really know very well what's happening in Europe. I mean, I was responsible for telecoms for a while. Heavily regulated industry, you would expect them to know what's going on. I mean, how will this regulation evolve? Clueless, totally clueless. Here are 10 people, investment analysts, who are sitting on like 15 billion euros because we wanted more investment in the networks. Nelly Cruz, again, they didn't have a clue where the market was going. And so I think there is part of this, is awareness raising, is trying to squash some of these kind of perceptions, these biases, these misunderstandings. And this will take a bit of time, but that's why we need to start immediately.
well, in defense of Europe, or not maybe even defense, but just to lest people think Europe is a problem or is a problem child or falling behind, I would again, and I personally believe the core issue for security in the digital world is a strong ID. I cannot believe how behind and backwards this is in the United States. I cannot believe that I actually I can't believe I had to write physical checks, but beyond that, I mean that the old model of a name at domain at top-level domain plus a password, which worked for 3,500 people during the era of BitNet in the 1980s, is still used as the primary form of security here in the United States. And I think Equifax or the OPM hack, or, well, in fact, most of the hacks we see come out of a refusal here in the United States to address the issue of a strong digital identity, which ultimately has to be guaranteed by something like the government. It already does it with a passport, but it won't do it in the digital sphere. And so I am far more secure in Europe than I am in the United States, where there is no real strong digital identity unless you work for the US government in some departments.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say I won't speak to having a national ID, but I do think that the issue of security is a competitive issue, and it's ultimately an issue of trust. I mean, again, all platforms really depend on the trust of both the users and developers, and if you lose that, and I think we're starting to see that a little bit with what happened in response to the Equifax hack, which really wasn't just about Equifax customers, but pretty much anyone who engaged in a meaningful transaction recently, is that once people lose that trust, they're more reluctant to engage in any kind of commercial activity online.
Yeah, well, I would just say, I mean, my idea is that maybe people should look at what Europe is doing in this regard, because that is where things will go anyway, in one form or another, because there's far more attention paid to trust. We even have laws. We have the ADAS directive that actually specifies things that you don't have in the United States, which sets a minimum bar for security for transactions online, if you so choose to use it.
Well, I would just like to come back on the previous issue. Indeed, I mean, I think security is one issue where you can see that actually Europe is, I think, quite advanced, maybe more aware of certain issues than other parts of the world. But I also think, I mean, when you mentioned that everybody only dreams to go to Silicon Valley, I think it's interesting, of course, for everyone to have been here, to see the energy, to see how things work. But I think increasingly we're realizing that we have a huge strength, because we may not have one Silicon Valley with a capital S, but we have a lot of different hubs, I mean smaller, let's say, Silicon-type valleys, which are very attractive and which are very often very specialized in different sectors. Like, I mean, we have hubs more focused on creative industries. We have hubs more linked to the health sector. And I think this is something which is still sometimes underestimated, and which actually can be very attractive for not only for Europeans themselves, but also for the rest of the world, because you can also have the link-ups then with mid-caps and larger companies on the manufacturing side or on the health sector. And I think this is something, I mean, we actually also from a policy side trying to build on in order to value the different, I mean, startup hubs we actually having.
Well, in general, I advise everyone to stop saying what, I mean, as you said yourself, something is the next Silicon Valley. I think you have to everyone has to get used to the idea that Silicon Valley is like Rome. I mean, it's not, I mean, no one's going to recreate it. No one's going to say, we're going to be the next Rome. The specific conditions that led to the creation of this micro environment here, which is compared to the rest of the country, is something that you cannot recreate. You have to do things other ways, and I wish everyone would, no one would ever again say, we will be the next Silicon Valley, because no one's going to do that. With that, they're saying it's time to go. It was a quick talk. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists.